A sitting president can now face prison, but only sometimes. That's the paradox the Supreme Court just dropped into American law. After 248 years of avoiding this question, the court finally ruled on how much criminal protection a president really has. And the answer isn't clean, it's a split reality. Absolute immunity on one side, zero immunity on the other. And the difference between those two could decide whether a former president ever sees the inside of a courtroom. This matters to you more than it sounds, because this ruling doesn't just affect Donald Trump. It quietly redraws the boundary of power for every future president. What they can do, what they can't, and what happens to them after the title disappears. For the first time, the court is saying out loud that the presidency is not a permanent shield. The breaking news hits live on air. Programming is interrupted. This is the big one we've been waiting for, the anchor says. Chief Justice John Roberts writes the opinion. The vote is 6-3. The dissent comes from Justices Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson. Those are the facts. But facts alone don't tell you why this moment feels different. Because here's the part nobody is saying out loud yet. This ruling doesn't protect a president from prosecution. It creates a test, and someone else gets to grade it. The court says presidents are immune for official acts, but not for unofficial ones, which sounds simple until you realize that deciding what counts as official is where all the power now lives. And once that line exists, every major action taken in office can be dragged back into question, not during the presidency, after it. So the real issue isn't what the court just protected, it's what they just exposed. What happened next is where the story widens beyond one person. The ruling itself sounds narrow if you only hear the headline. Presidential immunity exists, but only for official acts. No immunity at all for unofficial ones. On its face, that feels like a compromise, but notice how little information that actually gives you. The court didn't tell us exactly which acts qualify. It didn't list protected behaviors. It didn't draw a bright line. It handed that job to lower courts and walked away. This didn't happen in a vacuum. While the Supreme Court was defining immunity, a lower court, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, was tearing through Trump's legal defenses. On the same timeline, that court rejected the idea of a self-pardon, narrowed immunity even further, and made clear that many of the acts Trump is accused of were personal or campaign-related, not presidential duties. Those are facts stated plainly in the coverage. And when you put those two decisions side by side, a pattern starts to emerge, because this is no longer just about whether a president is immune. It's about who decides when a president stops being one in the eyes of the law. The Supreme Court says immunity depends on the nature of the act. The lower courts are already signaling that most of the conduct at issue doesn't qualify. That creates a funnel, and funnels only move in one direction. Here's the reframing question you're supposed to ask now. If immunity depends on how an action is classified, and judges control that classification, how much protection is actually left? And more importantly, how fast does it disappear once a presidency ends? This is where the story flips from constitutional theory into something far more concrete. Because once the rules exist, they start getting applied. And the first application hits much harder than the abstract idea ever did. The claim at the center of this moment is simple but dangerous. Trump's legal shield is far weaker than it looks. That's not speculation. It's coming straight from the courts. On air, analysts zero in on the language that matters most. A president is entitled to at least presumptive immunity from prosecution for all his official acts, but there is no immunity for unofficial acts. That single distinction changes the entire battlefield, because the D.C. Circuit Court has already said that many of the actions Trump is charged with were personal or campaign-related, not presidential duties, not core constitutional authority. That detail matters more than any headline, because once an act is labeled unofficial, immunity disappears completely. No balancing test, no gray zone, just exposure. And notice what's missing here. There's no guarantee that a court will treat controversial decisions as official just because they happened in the White House. Location doesn't matter, title doesn't matter, purpose does. This is where the pressure starts to build. Trump's defense strategy was built around two ideas: immunity and delay. Delay until elections pass, delay until politics shift, delay until the rules protect him. But this ruling quietly removes the safety net underneath that strategy. It doesn't end the cases. It accelerates them toward a different question. And that question is brutal. If a jury ever hears the facts, can he survive them? Because once immunity is stripped away, the fight is no longer about constitutional theory. It's about evidence. And evidence is much harder to outrun. Now watch how fast this escalates, because once immunity narrows, history starts to matter. For decades, the presidency functioned like a legal buffer, not written anywhere, just assumed. Presidents might face consequences politically, but criminally, the system hesitated. That hesitation became a norm, and norms, once established, feel permanent right up until they break. This ruling breaks one. The courts are no longer treating presidential power as something that fades gently. They're treating it like a switch, on while you're in office, off when you're not. The D.C. Circuit spells this out directly. Once a presidency ends, the former president becomes a private citizen again. Evidence can be presented. Trials can move forward. No special lane, no constitutional pause button. That's a sharp departure from how this used to work. Think about past exits from the White House. Legal exposure was theoretical, not operational. Even Nixon avoided trial through a pardon from Gerald Ford. That was an external act of mercy, not a legal right. This time, the courts are saying mercy is optional, not automatic. And here's the normalization that should feel uncomfortable. The idea of a former president standing trial is no longer treated as unthinkable. It's treated as procedurally normal. The courts speak about it calmly, clinically, as if this outcome was always built into the system and just never activated. But it wasn't activated until now. Once something becomes normal in law, it stops being shocking. It becomes process. And process is relentless. That's the escalation people miss. This isn't a dramatic collapse. It's a controlled descent. And once it starts, there are very few places to step off. The second proof hit is where the words and the reality finally collide. Because while the Supreme Court was outlining protection in theory, the lower courts were listing consequences in practice. One of the clearest examples comes from the rejection of the self-pardon idea. The D.C. Circuit states it plainly: a president cannot pardon himself. A pardon is an act of mercy from one person to another. You cannot grant mercy to yourself. That door is closed completely. That matters because Trump openly suggested that self-pardon as an escape route. It wasn't a fringe theory, it was part of the strategy, and now it's gone. At the same time, the court also says immunity does not apply to crimes serious enough to be impeachable. That's not a side note. It's central, because many of the charges described in the coverage, their election interference, mishandling classified documents, fall directly into that category. Here's the contradiction you can't unsee once it's pointed out. Publicly, the argument was that presidential power demands maximum protection. Privately, the courts are saying that power collapses the moment it's used for personal gain. If an act helps the office, there may be protection. If it helps the person, there is none. And notice what that reframes. This isn't about whether Trump was president when something happened. It's about why he did it. Motivation becomes legally decisive. That's a profound shift. It means courts are no longer just examining actions, they're examining intent. Once intent enters the equation, immunity becomes fragile. Because intent is something prosecutors can argue, documents can reveal, and witnesses can testify about. This is the line that permanently changes how you see the issue. Presidential power isn't judged by title anymore. It's judged by purpose. And once that standard exists, the ground underneath the defense starts to crumble. What happens next is the mini crisis people underestimate, because this doesn't arrive as one trial, one verdict, one moment. It stacks fast. First, the New York case, 34 counts already decided. Then the federal election case, 4 counts that on paper add up to decades. Then the classified documents case with roughly 40 counts tied to records physically found at his home, backed by recordings and testimony from his own staff. Then Georgia with racketeering charges layered on top. Different courts, different jurisdictions, same defendant. This is what pressure looks like in real time. No single case has to end everything. They just have to keep moving. And the courts have now said they can. Once immunity is stripped from an act, it doesn't get reconsidered later. It moves forward. Evidence gets shown, juries get seated, timelines stop being theoretical. Here's where speed becomes the threat. Trump is 78 years old. That's not commentary. That's a fact stated directly. Even moderate sentences served concurrently change meaning when when age enters the equation. A 10-year sentence at 82 isn't a chapter, it's an ending. And prosecutors know this, judges know this, everyone in the system knows this without having to say it. This is why the legal exits suddenly feel sealed. No self-pardon, immunity narrowed, delay tactics weakened. What's left isn't strategy, it's exposure. And once multiple cases advance at once, control disappears. You're no longer managing a defense, you're reacting to a cascade. So the question stops being, can this happen? And becomes, what happens if this continues? This is where it stops being abstract and starts touching real life. Because none of this stays confined to courtrooms or legal language. It leaks outward. When a former president faces multiple criminal trials, everything around it tightens. Elections feel different. Institutions behave differently. The pace of politics accelerates. And ordinary people feel the pressure long before any verdict arrives. Think about what this does to the country you live in. Campaigns turn into legal shields. Court dates become political flashpoints. Every ruling triggers market reactions, protests, counter-protests, and nonstop media cycles. That noise isn't distant. It shapes what laws get passed, what crises get attention, and what problems get ignored. And then there's the quieter impact. The idea that the presidency once acted as a firewall is gone. Future presidents know that when they leave office, their actions don't fade into history, they wait. Every call, every document, every meeting, that knowledge changes behavior at the top, and those changes ripple downward. If you've ever felt like politics has become a constant state of tension, this is why. The stakes aren't just policy anymore. They're personal freedom versus power. And when those stakes rise, compromise disappears. Everything becomes existential. If this feels familiar, like the system has been living in crisis mode for years, say so in the comments, because that feeling isn't accidental. It's a byproduct of what happens when legal consequences finally catch up to political power. Here's the systemic insight most coverage avoids. This didn't happen because of one person. It happened because of incentives. For years, the system rewarded delay, spectacle, and ambiguity. Legal fights became political theater. Political power became leverage against accountability. And the longer that cycle ran, the harder it became to stop without breaking something. This ruling is the system choosing to break the pattern instead. Notice how carefully the court moves. It doesn't declare presidents untouchable. It doesn't declare them fully exposed either. It builds a mechanism. Official acts get protection. Private acts don't. Judges decide which is which. That structure shifts power away from politics and toward process, quietly, methodically. And that's what makes it unsettling. There's no dramatic announcement that no one is above the law. There's no moral language, just rules. And once rules exist, they don't care who you are. They don't respond to rallies or polls or narratives. They respond to evidence and procedure. This is how systems reassert control, not through confrontation, but through inevitability. The spectacle fades, the leverage weakens, the incentives change, and suddenly power doesn't protect itself the way it used to. That's why this feels different from past scandals. It's not emotional, it's mechanical. And once a system turns mechanical, it's very hard to stop without rewriting the rules again. Now we're at the near future fork, and neither path is stable. From here, there are only two realistic trajectories. The first is delay with diminishing returns. Lower courts spend months sorting official acts from private ones. Hearings pile up, motions fly. But this time, delay doesn't erase the endpoint. It just pushes it forward. Once those classifications are decided, trials don't slow down. They speed up. Prosecutors now know exactly where immunity does not apply, and they will aim there relentlessly. The second path is political reversal. Winning the presidency again would temporarily restore leverage. Not immunity in the absolute sense, but time, influence, and procedural control. That's why the stakes feel so extreme. This isn't just an election cycle anymore. It's a race between the calendar and the courtroom. Here's the part that makes both paths unstable: age. The coverage keeps returning to the math because the math doesn't bend. Trump is already in his late 70s. Even a single conviction with a long sentence becomes decisive at that point. 10 years isn't a punishment, it's a finish line. And that reality shapes every move being made right now on both sides. Notice the uncertainty the courts leave hanging. They don't promise conviction, they don't promise acquittal, they promise process. And process means momentum. Once momentum exists, outcomes stop feeling hypothetical. They start forming. The next move isn't years away. It's already being prepared in filings, hearings, and scheduling decisions most people never watch. And whichever path wins, it locks the other one out. That's the pressure building underneath everything you're seeing. Because once the next step lands, there's no clean reset. Here's the insight that ties all of this together. This ruling isn't really about Donald Trump. It's about what happens when power finally expires. For decades, the presidency felt like something that followed you forever. Status lingered, protection lingered, consequences blurred. The court just said that illusion has an end date. One sentence reframes the entire story. Presidential power now has a clear off switch. Not when the cameras turn off, not when public attention moves on, when the term ends. After that, actions get sorted, motives get examined, evidence gets weighed, and the system does what systems do when ambiguity disappears. It moves forward. That's why this moment feels heavier than a single ruling. It closes an era where delay itself was a defense. It replaces chaos with sequence. End of term, courtroom, verdict. That's the loop the courts just activated. And once that loop exists, it doesn't just apply to one man. It applies to every future president watching this unfold right now and recalculating their own limits. The next chapter of this story won't start with a dramatic announcement. It will start quietly in lower courts, in scheduling orders, in rulings most people scroll past. But by the time the public feels it, the direction will already be set. If you want to understand how power actually works when the spotlight fades and what comes after the office, follow for what comes next. Because this ruling didn't close the book. It turned the page.